So if you thought that impeaching Trump was political theater, then what would you call this? This is a disgrace. And I hope that someday top Republican officials will find some integrity. In the case of Trump, because you fear his social media wrath, right-wing officials will deny all evidence against Trump come hell or high water. But in the case of President Joe Biden, you decided to start the impeaching now and figure out the whole evidence thing later. And you still haven't figured it out. I want to see whether you'd raise your hand. Should Hunter and Trump both be held accountable if they're found guilty on any of their indictments? Raise your hand if you think that equal justice under the law applies and Trump should be held accountable. I think it is worse than embarrassing that Republicans won't raise their hands. They refuse to say that equal justice under the law should apply to everyone. And when you step back and think about it,
then what about the
kind
January
of scary.
6th defendants?
It's kind of scary. This double standard insults the institutions of Congress that people fought and died to build. This impeachment hearing clearly is not about justice. Migrants sleeping on the streets of Texas may be a better shot for Fox News cameras, but it's a much worse deal for everyday people. In Texas, we are still mourning those killed by a mass shooter in Allen. We're seeking justice for the kids and the teachers killed in Uvalde. We haven't fixed our electric grid, and people are struggling to pay the rent and the mortgage. We need help from this Congress, but instead we get hate for immigrants. And I still cannot understand from the Republican majority why they think that DACA recipients who are paying billions of dollars in taxes to pay for health care programs should not have health insurance and should instead go to the emergency room. Providing people health care isn't a reward. It's not charity. It's what we do because people go out and work and participate in society. And when my seniors need access to Medicare, I don't say this is a reward or this is charity. I say, thank you. This is what we owe to one another. And we should do the same thing no matter who you are or where you were born in this country. It is not a reward. We should just be doing the right thing. We are facing a government shutdown, which could impact tens of thousands of Americans, hundreds of thousands of federal employees. We know that the government doesn't need to shut down. Those services can be paid for if billionaires and their big corporations finally pay their fair share. The budget deal that Republicans forced, holding the economy hostage earlier this year, eliminates much of the IRS funding that we need for enforcement. But now we're hearing in this hearing more and more attacks from the Republican majority trying to cut IRS funding from the Inflation Reduction Act. And that funding we need not only to go after billionaires and big corporations, but we need it in order to reduce our deficit. Instead of talking about how to support all of our youth, especially our most vulnerable youth, people in my state, like Greg Abbott, have used their government power to pick on trans kids and get TV news hits about those kids' ability to play in sports. In my view, instead of spending our time picking on trans youth, we should be listening to them, bringing community together, figuring out how to solve the real challenges that our youth face, rather than angling for the latest segment on Fox News. I'm Greg Casar. I'm a brand new member of Congress representing Texas, and I'm standing over here on the Republican side of the aisle, not because I'm a Republican. I'm a Democrat, but I want the American people to see that there isn't any Republicans in the seats here behind me on the eve of our default. Where are the Republicans? This is not a simple political disagreement. This is a dire crisis being imposed on the working people of America. The American people could lose millions of jobs. You could lose your house. Your kids could lose their job. People could lose their savings, and they aren't even here. They want to burn the house down and blame the firefighters for the flames. They're listening to Donald Trump, who's saying, do a default. That is shameful. It is dangerous. There's no patriotism in this. There's no morality in this. And we just need 5 Republicans to sign on to the discharge petition with us to save the American people. We need the American people to speak up about why the Republicans are not in these empty chairs. The American people can save us. The Democrats are aligned and ready to avoid a default and make sure that billionaires pay their fair share and folks aren't kicked off their health care or deprived of food. Thank you. I was here alongside all of you during the State of the Union when my Republican colleagues stood up and started jeering and booing and yelling, complaining, saying that indeed they said they weren't interested in cutting Social Security or Medicare. But in the weeks since, it's become clear to me that that was all talk and no votes, or as we say in Texas, all hat and no cattle. In fact, this week, the Republican head of appropriations just said that she wants to see even deeper cuts to critical federal programs. That means bigger classroom sizes for our students and our struggling teachers, longer wait times for our veterans seeking health care, all to finance bigger tax cuts for billionaires and multinational corporations. Social Security and Medicare are not safe until we step up and vote to make sure they are safe. And that's why I urge my colleagues to defeat the previous question so that we can vote for H.R. 178, which would put our money where our mouth is. So I urge my Republican colleagues to prove me wrong, because we're planning on voting on this week are things like a ludicrous gas stove bill of rights. Are you kidding me? What we're talking about voting on this week is deregulating gun accessories that have been used in mass shootings across the country. Really? It is disrespectful, it is dangerous, and it is a distortion of our oaths and our job that we've committed to doing here today. So instead of bowing to the gun lobby or passing these ludicrous messaging bills, let's work on solving real problems, or at a minimum, let's stop these attacks on Social Security and Medicare. I yield back. I'm Greg Casar, and I represent the heart of Texas. Today, thousands of my constituents are freezing without electricity. As Texans try to survive the cold weather and a climate crisis being ignored in our state, they're also worried about paying for housing. They're worried because they've had their workers' rights stripped away, reproductive rights stripped away, voting rights stripped away. They're worried that their kid could be shot in school. These are the concerns of the people, but Republican leadership here is working on none of these issues. Instead, they're trying to redistribute wealth from working class families to their biggest corporate donors. But even though Texans may be without electricity today, we are far from powerless. We have a history of organizing for change in Texas. The same electricians who are getting the lights back on, the same medics caring for our sick are sick and tired of right-wing extremism. And these working families will be the ones to organize and create a true democracy where the people lead and the politicians follow. Mark these words as my first here in this chamber. I yield back the balance of my time. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to begin with a quote. The people of America elected all 435 of us to do the things they expect Congress to do. Real business, not theater. Try to have some type of prescription drug reform legislation this year. But instead, the majority party is conducting baseless impeachment hearings. Who do we think said this quote? Was it Nancy Pelosi? Maybe Ranking Member Jamie Raskin? Mr. Chairman, you might recognize that quote because you said this in 2019. You said it on the floor of the U.S. House, saying impeaching Donald Trump was political theater. Trump was first impeached for attempting to extort a foreign president into helping the Trump presidential campaign. And if you didn't consider that criminal, how about when Trump was impeached trying to overthrow the results of the presidential election and then incited a violent insurrection against the government? Your own Republican-called witnesses today say they don't see the evidence to impeach President Joe Biden. Bunch of stuff about Hunter this, Hunter that, but they've said they don't see the evidence to impeach Joe Biden. That is a disgraceful double standard. It damages our democracy, insults the institution of Congress, and more than anything, disgraces this body in the eyes of the American public. This inquiry is a cynical attempt to tar everyone, to make everyone look suspect, make everyone look corrupt, so that voters just give up and say, there's not much difference here. But we cannot give up on discerning truth from propaganda. We cannot give up on our collective governance. Congress is a place where historically people of enormous integrity have throughout history taken on big challenges of inequality, injustice, instability. We can and must impartially look at the evidence before us and have equal justice under the law. And the evidence before us shows no wrongdoing by President Biden. We haven't seen that evidence throughout the testimony today. Your own Republican-called witnesses have said they haven't seen that kind of evidence. There is separate evidence that supports indictments, unrelated indictments against his son, Hunter, and multiple indictments spanning 91 criminal charges against former President Trump. I, for one, am grateful we have an independent judicial system where a president's son or a former president like Trump can be investigated and prosecuted if they violate the law. It is my firm belief that Hunter and Trump should both face trial and, if guilty, be held accountable for the crimes they've been accused of. Can everyone on the Oversight Committee say the same thing? We cannot say equal justice under the law for everyone except for the guy who holds the leash. I'll yield the rest of my time to Ranking Member Raskin.
Thank you. I think as you were being interrupted by several colleagues, I heard one question posed by the distinguished gentlelady from Georgia who said, what about the January 6th defendants, all of whom had lawyers, due process, the presumption of innocence, and they were convicted of various things, including assaulting federal officers and Metropolitan Police.
What about
as well as
Antifa BLM rioters
point
and
of
$2 billion of damage
Mr. Raskin,
in
if I
America?
can take my time back.
Yes, I'll yield
We've
back.
heard, because it wasn't on the microphones, multiple members saying it's wrong that January 6th rioters were convicted by a jury of their peers. That is disturbing. We've started to get used to it, but we can't get used to it. It's scary.
Gentleman's time has expired.
I'm the son of immigrants and proud to represent the heart of Texas here in the United States Congress. For generations, my family has moved back and forth between Texas and Mexico, Mexico and Texas. People immigrate, sometimes in search of safety, sometimes for economic opportunity, but always for family and a better life. What folks aren't immigrating for is to bring fentanyl into the country, as folks on the other side of the aisle have been talking about time after time after time in committee. It was laid out very clearly that over 90% of folks arrested for fentanyl trafficking are U.S. citizens and lawful residents. In fact, this bill would eliminate funding for much of the remaining legal immigration system that we have, leading to chaos. But chaos, unfortunately, is what top Republican officials want. They want the immigration system to stay broken so that they can blame Democrats for it. This is a case of arsonists blaming the firefighters for the flames. For example, Congressman Castro and I worked with the Biden administration to expedite funding to Texas this month to ensure that migrants can sleep in a safe shelter while they process their immigration case instead of being in a tent on the border. In stark contrast, this Republican bill in front of us today would ban these sorts of shelters and services. We should be creating an economy that works for everyone, immigrant and native-born. We should be expanding our freedoms, not ripping away people's rights. Let's welcome asylum seekers fleeing violence and catastrophe with a safe and orderly system. Let's create pathways for legal immigration rather than the broken system today that forces people to go around the rules. Let's work towards a safer and more just and more prosperous Western Hemisphere so that we reduce those factors that are pushing mass migration. Let's look at the role of U.S. sanctions that starve people abroad instead of feeding them. Let's recognize that immigrants are a key part of our past and our present in this country. Many of our joint faith traditions call for us to care for our neighbors, near and far. I remember when my priest told me the story of how the Holy Family was prosecuted by King Herod, and how Jesus, Mary, and Joseph had to flee across the border into Egypt, across a big river. The priest said he forgets whether the river was called the Nile or the Rio Grande, but it's besides the point. Today, our story is no different. Thank you, and I yield back. Thank you. Just to be really clear about what it is we're debating today, the Biden administration has chosen to stop discriminating against DACA recipients so that they can buy health insurance on the exchanges like everybody else. They pay their taxes, billions in taxes, and thankfully, the Biden administration has said we're going to stop discriminating against DACA recipients just like we're going to treat them like other legally present people. And Republicans are arguing that we need to undo this really common sense change from the Biden administration. So I'll take this moment just to hear from anybody in the majority to hear why, if they're paying billions in taxes, we should keep discriminating against them. Or why, if a mom is pregnant, we all chip in, we all participate because we know we want her to be able to take care of her kids. That's why moms who are low income can get access to Medicaid. For the folks that are pro-life in this group, why is it that we want moms who are legally present in this country to not have access to health insurance? That's the question. It's the only question. If there's any takers, we have been in bipartisan hearings where we've engaged productively. This is confounding, and nobody, I want to hear why a mom who is legally present, who has paid her taxes, that we make sure we take care of moms in this country, but then we say, no, DACA recipients, we're going to take your labor, we're going to take your talents, we're going to take your sweat, we're going to take your blood, we're going to accept your brilliance, your talents, your inventions. But no, if you get pregnant, we're not here. You don't need health insurance. Chairwoman, anyone? It is shameful. It is absolutely shameful. What DACA recipients have been asking for isn't charity, it's for us to stop punishing them. They grew up in this country, they immigrated here as children, and they've just said, stop punishing us. Let us live like everybody else. And DACA recipients who are hearing this and their family members should know that you have earned it. You shouldn't have to come and ask us for access to health insurance or to be treated like everybody else. It's something you earn every single day by taking care of your family members, by participating in this country, by taking care of school kids or at nursing homes or building amazing things in this country. You already have earned it, and it's just us who have kept you from having it. But thankfully, the Biden administration wants to stop this one little bit of discrimination, and we have a whole hearing about it, and nobody's willing to say why they want to take health insurance away from a pregnant mom. Or why they don't want to let somebody buy health insurance, why they want to send them to the emergency room where it's going to cost us more money and where people will die. We want to stop punishing people. We need to get to a place where we recognize we actually grow our economy, grow our tax base by including more and more people. Come to Texas, come to a construction site, and tell me what building gets built without immigrant workers. Tell me what inventions get invented without immigrant workers. Just come. But instead, what we see from Governor Abbott is punishing people and, frankly, killing people because he is putting drowning devices in the Rio Grande. A trooper just blew the whistle and said that they are putting out orders that will kill people. We got to stop punishing people, and we should just actually answer the hard question, which is, why should politicians keep on running to build their own power by punishing folks and threatening their lives? So I want to thank the Biden administration for doing the right thing on this, and I'll still be here waiting to hear just the baseline answer for why we want to take pregnant moms off of health care. Thank you, Chair. The Republican majority is hurtling towards shutting down basic services for people across the country in just 2 weeks, shutting the government down, shutting the country down. And while Democrats and frankly even Republicans in the Senate have said, no, we want to keep this government open. Let's just keep it open the way it is, or let's stick to the deal that we already agreed to keep it open. It seems like the Republican majority wants to close it while demanding unreasonable things that'll never pass, like kicking 100,000 kids out of their Head Start and preschool programs, kicking 20,000 working class people and seniors out of their housing, slashing funds for things like public education and climate action. And I get asked by my constituents back home in Texas, why would they do that? And to me, I think back to the very first votes I took on legislation under this Republican majority, which were votes to cut IRS funding so that billionaires could get away with cheating on their taxes, cut IRS funding so that big corporations could get away with not paying their fair share. And that's what we're dealing with again in this hearing. As we have keep on walking down this path where we could wind up in another government shutdown caused by the Republicans, we're having a hearing blasting the Inflation Reduction Act. And the Inflation Reduction Act, signed by President Biden, is the first time in my lifetime that I've seen a bill passed that finally holds corporations accountable to paying their taxes. Remember, in 2021, before the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy reported that at least 55 of the largest corporations in America paid no federal income taxes. And a 2021 paper from the Treasury Department estimated that the wealthiest 1% owe $160 billion in unpaid taxes each year. But finally, under this law, we take climate action, we address rising energy costs, we address rising healthcare costs, and hold corporations accountable by setting a 15% minimum corporate tax rate. This is overwhelmingly popular with the American people. So House Republicans have taken up to making false claims about the Inflation Reduction Act to scare people. I've been asked in union halls, walking down the street, in grocery stores by people saying, well, doesn't the Inflation Reduction Act hire like 87,000 new IRS agents? And they've heard this propaganda on the radio. They've heard it pushed out by right-wing officials. In fact, it was stated by the chair as she opened up this meeting. But to put this politely, that is false. The IRS funding in the Inflation Reduction Act, one, improves technology and customer service so constituents don't have to keep waiting for days or weeks to get answers from the IRS. And second, it sets up the resources necessary to make sure large corporations and the wealthy have to pay their fair share. Mr. Higgins, is it correct or incorrect that the Inflation Reduction Act is hiring 87,000 new IRS agents?
That is incorrect.
Thank you. In fact, according to one article and to much of our research, the IRS funding is just to get the number of employees back at the IRS where we were a decade ago. This article appeared in Time magazine titled, "Trump Allies Are Attacking Biden for a Plan to Hire 87,000 New IRS Agents, but that plan doesn't exist." I ask unanimous consent to insert this article into the hearing record. We are facing a government shutdown, which could impact tens of thousands of Americans, hundreds of thousands of federal employees. We know that the government doesn't need to shut down. Those services can be paid for if billionaires and and big corporations finally pay their fair share. Mr. Higgins, do you know that if we fund the IRS agents that we need, do we know if we fund them, does that increase the deficit or does it actually decrease the deficit?
That will help recoup lost revenues right now to close the tax gap and will reduce the deficit.
So we can reduce the deficit and have better funding for our programs if we stick with things in the Inflation Reduction Act and have those minimum corporate taxes. I discussed this in a July committee hearing, and I asked the chairman if we can finally have a hearing in this committee to start looking at corporate tax cheats and how the wealthiest people in this country get away with not paying their taxes. And I heard from Mr. Sessions that he was open to that, and I hope, Chair, that we consider finally having a hearing on this important topic. And I yield back. I want to take a step back and think about the big picture of what we've been talking about in this committee hearing when we talk about trans youth participating in sports. Because when we're here at the seat of government in the U.S. Capitol and we talk about young people, I think we should be talking about how we support them. And if anyone needs support, it's probably trans youth who are more likely to face bullying and isolation and doubt and usually have a harder time than most of our kids. Instead of funding schools, supporting teachers or counselors or youth programs, I've got an extremist legislature singling out what we've been talking about today, a small handful of kids who are already suffering from pain with more pain. Because those families that I've met with and talked about, they know that when we spend our time in these seats of power talking about them instead of with them about these challenges, that creates even worse mental health issues, even more just really hard times for some of these families who are now questioning their own residency in my state. That's what we're dealing with here today. And so like any other athlete, trans athletes sometimes win, sometimes they lose, but in talking with a very small handful of them, they talk about how this is a chance at camaraderie, this is a chance at relaxation, this is a chance at teamwork. We should be focused on expanding opportunities for all of our young people and find ways to let kids be kids. So now for my questions, Ms. Goss-Graves, are you aware of any reason to believe that allowing trans athletes to participate in girls' athletics is limiting opportunities for cisgender athletes?
Absolutely not. In fact, there's a lot of gender inequity in sports and in schools. The trans athletes are not the source of it. They aren't the source of resource inequity. They aren't the source of not having the same level of coaching. They aren't the source of not opening up new sports teams when you have a group of girls who say, I just want to try playing lacrosse, and your school won't start a lacrosse team. Trans athletes are not the reason that we have gender inequity in sports, and they are not the reason that 50 years after Title IX was passed, its broad promise of addressing sex discrimination in education is still unfulfilled.
Thank you for that answer. And so, Ms. Goss-Graves, how could we, since we're in these seats of power, better support women's athletics and increase opportunities for girls and women who want to participate in sports?
There's a range of things that would be important. You could provide additional resources to schools, especially schools who have fewer resources to devote to sports. Oftentimes what we have found in areas where they have fewer resources, what they end up doing is investing hugely into male sports programs and deciding that they're not going to invest in female sports programs. You could also take action on the information that has come out about sexual abuse in sports. Abuse by coaches, by athletic trainers, by sometimes medical doctors. This isn't something that's coming out about trans athletes. It is about schools looking away from the harm that their employees are causing. There are a range of things. I'd be happy to work with you and with this committee on it.
So, as Mr. Takano mentioned, the 4 trans athletes in Utah, it's not them that were caused the huge disproportionality in funding for men's sports versus women's sports. In fact, what you're saying here is it may not be trans athletes or isn't trans athletes taking opportunities away from women's sports. It might actually be guys like us on dioceses like this one not investing equally in women's sports. Actually, I have here an example from the Women's Sports Foundation saying that men received $252 million more in athletic scholarships than women in the years 2019 and 2020. A report released last year for the 50th anniversary of Title IX found that men's athletic programs received more than twice as many resources as women's athletic programs in 2020, and expenditures for recruiting and compensating head and assistant coaches favored male athletes about 3 to 1. So I want to enter both of those documents into the record. First, the May 2022 report from the Women's Sports Foundation titled 50 Years of Title IX. We're not done yet, so I'd like unanimous consent to enter that into the record, along with this report from 2022 from the NCAA titled The State of Women in College Sports. Thank you. So I think that this is a really important part of the question. One, how can we better support young people in general? And then second, if the claim is that by supporting trans young people and their mental health and their ability to be fully included in themselves, we're hurting women's sports, then we'll actually ask ourselves what is actually hurting women's sports. And it might be the amount of scholarship money that many of us who were male athletes immediately had access to that women athletes didn't have access to, or the fact that many of us who were male athletes could participate in sports over the summer and in the fall semester and in the spring semester and do a second set of sports, and that you already had your uniforms paid for, and you already had the ability to get state championships trips paid for. Maybe we could be talking about those things if we're going to be talking about sports. Ms. Goss-Graves, just to close here, how can bans on trans athletes participating in girls' or women's athletics actually also harm those cis students?
Well, we've talked a lot about the sort of sex verification that we have seen, and that is how you prove, how states are requiring proving up that you are girl enough or woman enough to play. But I also just want to say this has been studied. The issue of trans exclusionary policies, sports participation for girls overall in high school declined in states that had trans exclusion policies. So when we are inclusive, everyone wins.
Wait, so you're saying where there have been more trans-inclusive policies, you've actually had more women participate in sports in those days?
That is correct.
Thank you. I yield back.